The wins the last 2 weeks would typically be just checklist items for the Oklahoma football team en route to a Big 12 championship appearance. But we know what's happened the previous 3 weeks. So a win is a win. And the defense looked better. The offense obviously ran into a good defense. So we'll evaluate the Sooners against the Cyclones and then upcoming against the Baylor Bears right here at Sooners Live, coming your way each and every Wednesday at 11:30 a.m. Central Time. We don't have a show if we don't have Jason Ray, so we appreciate Jason being here each and every time. 87 consecutive. Jason, how you doing today?
Doing good, Mark. How about you?
Doing just fine.
Good.
Doing just fine. And always look forward to the show. Folks, leave your comments and questions there in the live chat, and we will get to them. And consider that the super chat's available. And you can hit us up at Venmo, PayPal, and Cash App as well. Search Mark Rogers TV. All right. I watched the extended highlights on the Iowa State game. So pretty much every play of the game just cut down. And certainly when you look at the scoreboard and you look at what the offense produced and what the defense limited, it's not anything that I don't think is difficult to understand. They were playing a team that wanted to bring down the score, take the air out of the ball, and that certainly was what happened. So the achievements on defense have to be disclaimed, that it was against an Iowa State offense that has struggled mightily against anybody this year. And at the same time, also understand that the Iowa State defense ranks at the very top of the Big 12 almost across the board. So what were your impressions of a game that included, of course, the highlight of the day was the fake field goal for the touchdown?
It was a little bit of a weird game, Mark. I think the first thing from a positivity standpoint that you look at and say, with all due respect to Iowa State, Oklahoma did a fairly decent job on the defensive side of the ball, forced 3 interceptions. One of them was nearly returned for a touchdown late in the game. But you take that with the caveat that you mentioned, Mark, that this is probably the least effective offensive team in the Big 12 at this point. Statistically, coming into the game, they were, and then obviously that proved out to be true. I think Iowa State. I haven't watched them a ton this year. I think Decker's made some interesting decisions in that game on a couple of plays. One was I think the interception by Danny Stutzman was a really good play, a good read by him, but the other ones were just forced passes, I think, in the coverage. But I think you take the small wins from a defensive perspective, Mark, as you would get them, meaning you didn't have any busts. You covered pretty well without any pass interference penalties, which has been the norm throughout the year. They tackled pretty well in space. Again, they held Iowa State's running game in check for majority of the game, and I think I like the other thing that you like from a positivity perspective, just kind of looking at the game overall, was the fact that as the fourth quarter was coming and Iowa State cut it to a 7-point game, and then Oklahoma quickly had a 3 and out, and then Iowa State got the ball. You kind of felt like that game was headed to overtime, but they got some stops, and then they certainly got that interception late that made that a 2-score game. So yeah, I think you've got, at this point in the season, you're obviously at where Oklahoma is this year. You're not necessarily worried about style points. You're worried about wins and losses and how you get that win, versus suffering that loss is really kind of inconsequential to the final score, right? But you said it correctly. I think this was a game that went about the way that you would expect it to go. I didn't feel like Oklahoma would get enough possessions to be able to get probably get this game into the 30s or the 40s, where they probably would have liked to have gotten or wanted to. But Iowa State's the best defense in the Big 12 statistically, and Oklahoma, particularly in the first half, they ran the ball pretty successfully. I think they had somewhere in the neighborhood of 130, 140 yards rushing in the first half. Not quite as good in the second half, particularly on the offensive side, rushing or either side, rushing or passing. But it builds some confidence, I think, for this team that's sorely in need of confidence, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. To only give up those 13 points, the 2 field goals and the touchdown was very positive. You would have liked to have put some more points on the board, but with the limiting of the possessions, and Oklahoma wasn't super successful really in the second half. Despite that one long touchdown pass to Jalil Farouk. But a win's a win, and you got 2 wins, in a row, and you're back in, somewhere in the middle of the pack of the Big 12, lower half, but still middle of the pack of the Big 12. That seems to be really controlled by TCU at this point, and there's a few others that are trying to get up there, but it sets up a really big matchup for obviously Oklahoma and Baylor, 2 teams that aren't where either one would have expected them to be. And I kind of chuckled about this, and as my dad and I and a couple of friends were talking about this game, who would have expected Oklahoma Baylor, number one, 2 teams that are unranked coming into this game, and this is a 2 p.m. local kickoff time on ESPN Plus. It just kind of shows how crazy the college football seasons can be. That no one would know. I mean, most people probably thought this was going to be a top 10 matchup at some point. That would, which would maybe decide which one, Oklahoma or Baylor, would have the inside track at that top spot in the Big 12. But as it is, they're playing for just the opportunity to go bowling, really. I mean, there's an outside chance that I think either one of them could get into the mix, but more than likely these guys will be, either one of these teams will be on the outside looking in. Mark, I don't know if you're on mute, but I can't hear you. I can't hear you. I don't know if you're on mute.
Sorry, Jason and everyone. There was some noise outside. So anyway, Baylor, I believe, is 3-2, aren't they, in the conference?
Correct. Yeah.
So the deal with Baylor would be that TCU's 5-0, so they're in great shape, obviously. Kansas State's 4-1. And then you've got Oklahoma State, Baylor, and Texas at 3-2. There's just an enormous difference between being 2-3 and 3-2. So at 3-2, I'd have to look at their schedule. I don't remember. I know that they've lost. I'm trying to think who they've lost to. They lost to
Oklahoma State and West Virginia.
Okay, that's right. So they would not have the tiebreaker against Oklahoma State. So they're basically a game back. So they need to beat Kansas State and then run the table, et cetera. Anyway, they've got a shot. They could finish 7-2, and then a 7-2 team should make the championship game unless there's some kind of tiebreaker there. But anyway, so they've got a shot still, but they got to be perfect. A couple things from the Iowa State game would be, it had the feel that once Oklahoma took the lead, that because of Iowa State's offense, that, anything can happen when it's only a 1-score game. Of course, you're only 1 play away from losing the lead at any point, but that Oklahoma had control of the game throughout the fourth quarter and so forth. So there was a sequence, though, just to point out a few things, where Iowa State scored to make it 20-13. There was probably 6 or 7 minutes left. They sacked Dylan Gabriel. Oklahoma was buried in its own territory. They punted out to midfield. So Iowa State's down a touchdown. They get the ball at midfield. And who knows if Oklahoma State would have truly stopped them. But to your point, Hunter Decker's airmails one over everyone. And I think that was the Justin Broyles pick.
Mhm.
He's back playing deep and the ball's right to him. He makes a really nice catch on the ball, but it's just a horrible throw. And that obviously bailed Oklahoma out of what could have been a drive to tie the game.
Yeah.
There was another sequence in the game where Iowa State had really good field position. They only had like a 3rd and 1 at midfield. They're starting a nice drive, and the ball gets snapped 100 miles past the quarterback, and there you go. You killed a drive. So there were some fortunate things that Oklahoma certainly took advantage of right there. Yeah, you mentioned Eric Gray had a 100-yard day, ran really well in the first half, took advantage of some room created by the offensive line. You see running backs as I do across the country. There's a ton of great ones, really good players. Where do you categorize him? How good do you think he is on the top end versus the very best backs?
Yeah, I think what he's done, Mark, this year, I think he's positioned himself to potentially be an all Big 12 running back. Certainly, I think certainly that number one spot, at least at this point, I would say belongs to Deuce Vaughn in terms of the best running back in the Big 12. But I think he's right there behind him in that conversation. Bijan Robinson obviously has probably a little bit more talent, but he's elevated himself to potentially being that guy. And I think the benefit that Eric Gray is getting is he's getting right now he's getting about 75% of the carries, whereas when you look at a guy like Bijan Robinson, I think it's more of a timeshare situation with Roshan there at Texas. But yeah, no, I think he's one of the things that he's been better at is running between the tackles. He's he's one of the top. I was trying to look this up, but one of the top running backs in the Big 12 this year in terms of yardage, yards per carry, and things like that. So he's put himself in position to eclipse 1,000 yards if he continues to have a pretty decent back half of these last 4 games. But yeah, no, I think he's made himself a lot of money this year, Mark. There was a lot of talk about potentially him leaving early last year. Didn't really put much on tape in terms of overall, but his ability to catch the ball out of the backfield, his ability to run between the tackles, his very rarely do you see him tackled by the first guy. He's very elusive in the open field, so he's a smaller back by stature, but I think he's certainly one of the better ones in at least top 3 in the Big 12 this year.
Marvin Mims didn't have the best day. I think he caught, he caught a couple passes for 16 yards, but he had some drops as well that might have extended
Yeah.
the lead and put Oklahoma in a really good spot.
Yeah, it was a little bit bizarre. Probably the worst game that Marvin Mims has played in Oklahoma uniform, not just this year, but his career. Yeah, as you mentioned, a lot of drops. I think he was a little bit frustrated that he wasn't able to get a couple of those long balls in one-on-one situations throughout the game, and maybe lost a little bit of focus and concentration. But yeah, no, it was certainly one of the one of the weakest performances from him, and certainly Oklahoma needs him to kind of get back to his normal Marvin Mims, stature, coming into this week's game against Baylor.
Absolutely. Talking Oklahoma football, we got Jason Ray here, as we always do. Sooners Live, right here at the Voice of College Football. Please jump on in and check it out. All right. Dylan Gabriel with a decent day. And again, Oklahoma takes care of Iowa State 27-13. Yeah, the ESPN3 designation for this game against Baylor. That's crazy. Usually these kind of games make their way onto ESPN2 somewhere or somewhere, FS1, but not this week. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know really what to say, but other than the fact that, it's nothing that it's nothing that anyone would have predicted early on in the season. I don't know, even a couple of weeks ago, but maybe the appeal of Oklahoma football is not, where it has been. Obviously, it's always going to be there locally, but nationally, where it has been in the last few years. So, um, yeah, not only but that it's an ESPN Plus game, but it's at a weird time slot on 2 p.m. Central, as well. So, selfishly for me, I was hoping this would either be a 11 a.m. or an evening 6:30 kick, because it's right in the middle of, um, which I know a whole lot of people maybe here listening don't care, as much, but Georgia and Tennessee kick off at 2:30 p.m., which will most people will be, watching that as well. So interesting in a lot of ways. I don't think when you look at the idea of, this game going up against that game, right at the same time, and I think is Alabama LSU at 2:30 as well, or is that no? That's an evening game.
Yeah, that's a night game.
Um, but
Yep.
still, going up on that time slot is interesting, and so maybe that's why ESPN elected to go, um, sort of off mainstream network there, with ESPN Plus. But it is what it is where Oklahoma's at this point.
As you scan the message boards and have contact with Oklahoma fans on Twitter and other locations and do all the research that you do, and you're highly invested in Oklahoma football, do people seem to be a little bit more reasonable about their take on this team as opposed to 2 weeks ago and before they notched a couple W's?
It's funny, Mark. I think there's, yes and no. I think to answer your question, I think most are starting to get a little bit more reasonable just in terms of understanding how good or maybe lack thereof from a talent perspective this team is, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. I thought, and me even to a certain degree with the coaching that was being brought in on the defensive side of the ball. Not that everything would be fixed, but this team would be much better defensively than they have been. So I think the defensive side of the ball is probably the thing that most people are maybe scratching their heads a little bit at. But with a first year head coach and a first year coordinators, coaches on just kind of getting acclimated to the talent, I think the consensus seems to be that the talent isn't at the level that they need it to be, on the defensive side of the ball, or maybe even specifically in the trenches. But and the talent that Oklahoma's had there is not just playing up to the potential. So, I think there's going to be a fair amount of player turnover, this year, just from just from what I understand, just kind of reading between the lines. I think there might be some surprising people, or some surprising kids to some people that may hit the portal, after the season is over, just based on this not being the way some of these kids have played this year, is not being the standard that Oklahoma needs, from a defensive side of the ball. But no, there's always those optimistic fans, right, that still think that Oklahoma has a decent opportunity to go 9-3, run the table, and perhaps get back into that, Big 12 race. Which I'm not saying it's not possible. I think all these games, when you see what Texas Tech did, against Baylor, when you look and see what Oklahoma State did against Kansas State, and then how poorly West Virginia is playing right now. I think you look and you see, hey, there's potentially an opportunity there for Oklahoma to run the table, but I think it's important for them to have a good finish to the season, whether it's running the table, whether it's getting to 7 or 8 wins. I think it's really important for, the off season, and recruiting and things like that, just to continue to have that positive momentum ending the season.
Oh, yes, recruiting. So you mentioned the name of one David Hicks before we started to record here. And of course, there was disappointment that he chose Texas A&M, but we still have a few months until National Signing Day. So Oklahoma fans are understandably so. They're going to latch on to any type of evidence that's out there that may point to him changing his mind. So you've picked up on something there.
Yeah, so and I think there's some, and again, this is more social media message board fodder to a certain degree, but so the belief out there from multiple sources is that Hicks has really not talked, had much discussion with the Texas A&M staff since that commitment. Um, Hicks has been very pro Oklahoma, just in some of his mentions and things like that, and he still has the visit scheduled to Oklahoma on the 19th. So where I'm kind of at with that is it's not anything that I would necessarily get my hopes up on just yet. Um, I would just say that the door maybe not be completely closed on Oklahoma. So I know that the staff is still working on him, and things like that. So it could be something, Mark, that I wouldn't rule anything out until with not necessarily just with him, but any of these kids. I I wouldn't um, I wouldn't rule anything out, but I think the door is still slightly cracked with certainly him still continuing to plan on taking that visit to Oklahoma on the 19th against Oklahoma State.
All right, everyone. Baylor's headed to town. Blake Shapen, the quarterback who came in for Jerry Bohannon last year and played extremely well down the stretch, won the job, and Bohannon was off to South Florida. He's the starting quarterback, 67% completion percentage, 13 TDs and 5 picks. You got Richard Reese at running back, 12 touchdowns. He's had a nice season, should gain 1,000 yards. And Baylor stands at 3-2 in the Big 12. They've got a loss to BYU outside the conference in overtime. So certainly leave any comments or questions concerning the matchup, Oklahoma Baylor, or anything else concerning the Sooners there in the live chat. Meanwhile, why not look at the college football rankings? All right. So I'll serve it up this way, Jason. Of course, this first rankings, for anybody that says, okay, it doesn't matter, why do people get uptight? Understandably, there's a whole lot of football left to be played, so nobody's made the playoffs yet, and nobody that's reasonably a contender has been eliminated. But at the same time, I'll make 2 points, and then you can take this wherever you want. One would be that TCU's at number 7. So TCU being at number 7 tells us a lot about what the committee thinks of them, what they think of everybody else that's in front of them, including a one-loss Alabama team. So they've set the stage for what they're talking about, how they evaluate a TCU team that has already defeated probably 2 of the 3 best teams in the conference. So they've already beaten Oklahoma State and Kansas State, and have Texas as really the one semi-marquee win left, and they don't have a whole lot except a Big 12 championship game. So if they've been shunned down to 7, that says a lot. And then the other thing that's going to tell us a lot, I think, Jason, so we're a week away from this, is the conclusion of the Tennessee-Georgia game. Let's say that's a decent game. Where does the loser drop? How far? Because the committee can drop them as far as they can drop them to a certain extent, but the way they've treated the SEC and the quality of the loss, and saying, okay, well, if you're number 1 in the country and you go on the road and you lose to the defending national champion, let's say if Tennessee loses to Georgia, none of us should be surprised if Tennessee only drops to 4 or 5. So that's going to be the telling tale for next week. That's going to continue to tell us the narrative and what they deem important. But for right now, for me, the one that stood out to me is TCU at 7.
Yeah, no, I agree, Mark, and it did me as well. I thought there was maybe a chance that you would see TCU and Alabama flip-flopped there, but it's out. No matter what criteria the committee thinks that they're looking at and what they're telling the general public. you would have a hard time actually believing that they would be willing to rank TCU ahead of Alabama just because of, hey, it's Alabama, right? And it's TCU. So I think TCU's in a tough spot, Mark. They're in a tough spot because now, to their benefit, they have Texas Tech at home this week, but then the next 2 weeks they go to Texas and then to Baylor. So, I think if they were to win those 2 games, I think maybe that gives them a little bit more credibility. Not that they shouldn't have that already, to your point with beating Oklahoma State and Kansas State, but I think the fact that if you're able to go on the road and win these games versus those games being at home, maybe that means a little bit more. But I think in terms of your comment about Tennessee, yeah, I mean, I think if it's a fairly close game, I think the point spread is like 8.5. So I mean, I think if you're within 10 points, Tennessee loses that game within 10 points. I think the how good their resume has been or is at this point, and how well they're playing, certainly right now, I think they probably don't drop any further than 4 or 5, which again leads to an interesting, kind of an interesting conversation here, and one that me and some people were having when you fast forward to the end of the season. So let's say that we have Ohio State and Clemson undefeated. They're in the playoffs, number 1, number 2, whatever the rankings end up being. And then you have really 4 teams in my mind really vying for 2 spots. You have Michigan, Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia. So let's say, just for argument's sake here, Tennessee loses to Georgia, and it's a 10-point game, and then basically that solidifies Georgia and Alabama in the SEC championship game. And let's say Alabama beats Georgia by 10 or less, in that championship game. And then you also have Michigan with, let's just say they have 1 loss to Ohio State, fairly close. Again, let's just say within that 10-point range, there. Who's your 2 teams that are in the playoffs, and who's your 2 teams on the out? I mean, I think for me, and I'll let you kind of give your thoughts as well here, but I know everybody doesn't. I put a lot of stock in winning a conference championship. But the fact that if you're Alabama, you win that conference championship, but you lost head to head to Tennessee, I would tend to think the way that we've seen that happen in the past, that you would see in that situation, you would probably see Georgia and Alabama as your playoff, your next 2 playoff participants with Tennessee and Michigan on the way out. But I mean, that's an incredibly strong resume that Tennessee would put on the table as a potential 11-1 team, with wins against Alabama, with, I mean, how LSU's playing right now, just a dominating win against LSU, a dominating win against Kentucky, and who knows what they do in the rest of these games. But again, that would be something interesting to see if that happened.
Yeah, so the SEC gets a ton of respect and credit, and then you've got basically a matchup of comparing possible 1-loss teams in the SEC versus undefeateds, let's say in the ACC and the Big 12. So what is the committee going to do with Clemson and TCU as undefeated champions versus 1-loss SEC teams that do not win the conference? If chalk ensues, which it won't, most likely, we've only got 4 games left, but we do have conference championship game weekend. But if we do have chalk, then we're going to have an undefeated Clemson ACC champion, an undefeated TCU as a Big 12 champion, although I don't know if I can speak for you. They've navigated it this far, but they've made it 8 weeks. They've got 5 left to go, and they've got Texas and even some other teams. TCU's no juggernaut that they can just look past anyone. They had a 34-31 game with just a minute left or whatever against West Virginia. They barely made it past them. So they can't look past anyone. They're not that good. And then they've got a Big 12 championship game where they're going to have to meet somebody that they already beat and defeat them again to get there most likely, versus what could play out in the SEC and the Big 10, that those teams are going to get a ton of respect from this committee because they already do. And wow, to see an Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee situation that you just played out, which is not probable, but it's very likely, where you've got an Alabama winner, they're in, and you've got Georgia sitting there at 12-1 and Tennessee at 11-1, and Georgia's got the extra win and went to the championship game, but Tennessee's got the wins that they do. And then this Ohio State, Michigan, unless something crazy happens in the Big Ten championship game, that's going to be 13-0 probably, and 11-1 out of those two. And you're looking at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 teams for 4 spots.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's not likely because they all have to avoid upsets except for when they play each other, but it's somewhat likely. Maybe TCU slips off and they lose, but still, you got a Clemson Big Ten SEC issue to sort through.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're right. I mean, I think unless some things happen that we don't expect, and certainly LSU's capable of beating Alabama this week, right? I mean, Alabama's lost. They've lost the one, and they've been very close to losing a couple more.
But how about that scenario? If LSU runs the table and they're the SEC champion at 11-2.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's a interesting. But I think when you look at TCU, I feel like, kind of getting back to the Big 12, I think TCU. I look at them very similarly to Cincinnati over the last couple of years. I think they're going to have some things happen in a very chaotic way for them to make their way into that Final Four. I think the Big 12 this year, although maybe a little bit better than it's been um, in the past in terms of just kind of top to bottom strength, maybe not necessarily at the top, but just overall conference strength is you're going to have more weight on the Big Ten. You're going to have more weight on the SEC, obviously. So I think if you have a Michigan that is 11-1 with a fairly close loss to Ohio State, I think you probably look at that situation. Would a Michigan 11-1 get in over a 12 or 13-0 TCU? It's debatable, right? I mean, I think when you look at TCU's resume, that'll be interesting to see to evaluate that as the season goes on, right? Because you looked at that Oklahoma State win. That's a really good win for TCU, especially the way that they came back. And then they go out and they lose 48-0 to Kansas State, which was one of the weirdest, inexplicable losses I've seen by a large margin in a long time.
Yeah.
So what's the value that Oklahoma State brings in that win, brings to the table, right? I mean, I think Oklahoma at the time, maybe it was a really good win, but now maybe not as good of a win as you thought it was at the time. I think Kansas State still that's the one that's a good win for them, specifically the way that they came back in that game and won that games. But so yeah, they're they're wanting chaos. They want a Notre Dame win this weekend. They want a LSU win this weekend. They want a you know, I mean, I don't know that it matters from a Georgia Tennessee perspective there, but you probably think that you're probably getting two teams in the SEC in. I would, unless something something crazy happens. I think there's probably two of those schools that are getting in between Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee, and even in a crazy situation, LSU. To your point, but that's why they play the games, right? And it'll be, especially this, what they call Championship November is going to be really, really exciting across the board, even if it's not necessarily as interesting here locally for Oklahoma sake. I think it's still it's still interesting for me. Tennessee just looks like one of those teams this year that is they've just gotten so much better. They remind me a little bit, Mark, of that LSU team a few years ago in terms of their defense isn't great, but I think it's good enough. And it's getting a little bit better each and every week. That they were really bad against Florida, but they're getting better each and every week. And they were really impressive against Kentucky this last weekend. I know Kentucky's not an offensive juggernaut, but still holding them to 6 points I thought was pretty impressive. So they look a lot like that team of LSU. I believe, what was that, 2018? The Joe
19.
Burrow
Yeah.
game. Yeah. And so we'll see how that goes. I'm really looking forward to that game against Georgia, because Georgia doesn't. I mean, they're still really, really good. Don't get me wrong, really good. They don't. It's interesting to see if Stetson Bennett is going to be the guy that will be able to kind of carry them to a win if they're not able to just dominate with a running game in their defense. One of the best defenses in the country against the best offense in the country right now statistically. So I think that'll be a really, really good game.
We've never seen a major conference champion go undefeated and not be selected to the playoff. That's what we could see here. TCU is the most likely candidate, and Clemson would be next, but I can't imagine them missing at 13-0. But I would feel bad for TCU and feel it to be unjust if they don't make the playoff at 13-0. Don't know what else they're supposed to do. But in addition to them rooting for Clemson to get knocked off or something to happen in the SEC where it's only one or two teams involved and not all three, and something in the Big Ten that's going to help them, which again is not really foreseen with Ohio State and Michigan. It looks like they're only going to lose the game against each other, and otherwise it's hard to imagine one of those two teams losing. TCU desperately needs something to happen in those three conferences. And then they also need, I guess it's going to be Kansas State and Oklahoma State to win the rest of their games to prop up their two best wins. Because otherwise, Oklahoma State and Kansas State they're no juggernauts. They're not great teams. They could lose a game or two. There could be a 9-3 team in the Big 12 championship game playing TCU. And they would get credit for that win, but it wouldn't be the kind of credit that you typically get playing in a conference championship game. Wouldn't give them that kind of boost.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think, because when you play that conference championship game, I think the benefit that you get, Mark, especially if you're trying to fight your way into playoff consideration, is you really want to be able to, maybe if you've got a loss or maybe a game that you didn't play, be able to really avenge that loss. Like one of the things that Oklahoma, that's been the benefit for them over a couple of years, is they've been able to avenge a loss in the in the regular season, they had when they lost to Texas early in the year, they were able to go and avenge that loss. They lost to Iowa State. They were able to avenge that loss. So I think those things are very important. So exactly to your point, if TCU ends up playing, let's just say they play Kansas State and they win that game in the Big 12 championship game. Well, I think the committee says, okay, we've already seen that. We've already seen that happen. And so what does that do for them? But yeah, no, I think you hit it on the head. I think you really you have a situation where they just have to have some chaos happen and have to have some things that in the interim they have to look really impressive on their side.
What matters to you in all this? So, I certainly have thought of ways that I think are better playoff formats, but beyond that discussion that we've had a number of times and will continue to have in the off season and with a 12 team playoff coming, but if you had to work within these parameters and you were on the playoff committee, how would you approach this? What would be important to you?
I think number one, I think there should not be any necessarily any AP coaches poll rankings. I think that clouds judgment, to a certain degree because there are certain teams, um, that certain teams that come in and we talked about preseason rankings. It's a lot about reputation. It's a lot about what this team has done in the past, and not necessarily what this team has done this year, right? So I think that's one thing. I think for me, conference championships are something that are very valid to me. Um, I think those I think a conference championship in certain instances kind of are a tiebreaker, in a certain way. So I think those things, and I know there's and I don't know if this is part of it. I know a lot of people are very, and me as a coach, I'm very much into analytics as well. But I think you've got to be able to take that away from it a little bit, and really just at the look at the eye test. Who do you think is the better team? Not necessarily, oh, this team beat this team by 3 points on the road on October, but here we are towards the end of November, first week in December. Like, who's playing the best at the right time? Um, and I don't know if there's a way to do this, Mark, but I think subconsciously it'll never happen. I mean, just because they're human. Um, but we got to find a way to stop comparing teams based on the school, based on, okay, when you look at, if you were to look at, lay down every single box score of the season, and you didn't label TCU and Alabama, I think almost probably 95% of people would probably have put TCU ahead of Alabama, not only win-loss record, but just just how Alabama struggled in some of those games. So it's an imperfect system. There's always going to be, whether you have 4 teams, whether you have 8 or 12 or 16, there's always going to be a next person, that next team that has a legitimate argument for getting in. So I don't think there's any number that will ever be a perfect number. But getting some of that bias out of it, and I think there's a lot of bias, in that room based on the people that have been selected to be part of that committee as well. So I think there's certain aspects for me that I think that this is better than the BCS, but I think there's certain aspects where the BCS was maybe a little bit more impartial, because it was certainly based on numbers and things like that. But the rankings are always going to be part of it.
At least what was the final I'm sorry, what was the final BCS formula? I think it was 2/3. It was still 2/3 human vote. I'll have to verify that.
Yeah.
2/3 human vote and 1/3 computers.
Yep.
I'm looking at the preseason AP poll, and this just goes to show you, and I don't expect myself, you, anybody to be perfect on projecting who the best teams in the country are before they've ever played, but just gives you a feel only 8 games into the season how difficult this is to do and how different the season is than what we projected to be. 6 of the, well, I'll say it this way, 4 of the top 10 teams in the country to start the season aren't even ranked. Notre Dame started number 5, Texas A&M 6, Oklahoma 9, Baylor 10. You also have Michigan State, Miami, Pitt, Wisconsin, Arkansas, Kentucky, practically the entire 10 through 20 is wiped out. You also have Cincinnati, Houston, and BYU as top 25 teams in the preseason. 13 of the 25 in the preseason aren't ranked now. You
Yeah.
can almost throw darts or just hand out ballots to people that are marginal college football fans, and you could fill out some of these are obvious. So yeah, it's it's funny how it plays out after what we think is going to happen.
Yeah, well, and it really is, Mark. And I think the one thing when you think about the playoff rankings, and one of the reasons I'm whatever the number is, if it's 8 or if it's 12, obviously we know it's going to be 12. At this point, the things that I like about 12 is the fact that there's 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 not this discussion about TCU, right? There's not this discussion about, okay, if they what do they need to happen? If they're probably even a one-loss team and they win their championship, like and win their conference championship, they're going to have an opportunity to play in the playoffs. And so we've discussed this so many times, but our sport, the one that we love the most, only having 4 teams to have the opportunity to play for a championship is, to me, is just very um, embarrassing for the sport. Just to get to this point. And who knows, once we get to 12, it may be a similar situation in terms of the games not being as as competitive as the playoff games are now. But I think it does at least give those schools opportunity to to play for a championship. And so and I don't know if they'll ever get to this point, but I would love to see a almost a separate group of 5 playoff as well. I mean, just because, like, it if you're a team, and I'm just gonna use a team local here. If you're a team like Tulsa, which has, it's a private school, has one of the lowest attendance for a FBS team in the country, maybe, enrollment, I should say, not attendance, but for, um how's a team like Tulsa expected to compete on the same level as a team like Alabama? Just the fact of the enrollment and the resources and everything that they have, they're never they're I say never, but Tulsa's never going to be able to compete with an Alabama or a Georgia, or Tennessee, or even in Oklahoma in terms of, being able to be there. So how how frustrating would it be if you're a program like Tulsa, like Northern Illinois, like Central Michigan, like any of these small teams, smaller schools, to have an opportunity to play um, for a championship? I mean, I think ultimately that's a lot of kids' goals, a lot of teams go like, "Hey, I want to be the best. Like, I want to try to be the best at what I can be as a team," and knowing that there's no way that you can accomplish that has to be frustrating to a certain degree. So maybe doing something like that um, would be good for those teams.
I do like that there's finally a determination on what to do with a group of five because we've lived in 8 years of how are they treated? Well, it all depends. Now there's going to be a definitive, they're given one spot. Like you, from a competitive standpoint, I don't necessarily know if that plays out well, as opposed to I think it would be fun throughout the latter half of December to have the top 12 to 16 teams in the Power Five be playing the playoffs on mostly Saturdays and then having a group of five top whatever they had, 8, 16, whatever they wanted to do, and those games be played throughout the week. And college football fans would, I think, love to see, a precursor into a big weekend of Power Five playoffs. Thursday of Cincinnati taking on Tulane and Boise State against UCF, or obviously those teams are going to be in the Power Five. But anyway, the top group of 5 teams playing.
Right.
Think about this one. The way things stand right now, let's take this season, for example, but jettison to the future of the 12-team playoff. The top 4 seeds are 4 conference champions. Okay. That number 5 seed is probably the SEC number 2 seed. So Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee. They're going to play the 12 seed, who's going to be the group of 5. So the group of 5 is almost always going to play the second best team in the SEC. So Tulane, here you go. Georgia, there's your first game. Your first and last game.
Right. And it's in Georgia. It's not like you're playing in a bowl game in a neutral site.
Yeah.
It's in Athens. Yeah, no, I'm with you. Those are, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's what it's probably more times than not, 9 times out of 10. It's going to be a group of 5 team playing either the second best SEC team or maybe in a odd scenario, maybe the second best Big Ten team. But still, you've got, I mean, this is better than what we have. I think it will end up being better than what we have, but still, you have that same situation, and I think who knows when, if it'll happen. I think most think it will. That there's going to be some breakaway from the NCAA by the Power Five schools. If that happens, maybe that puts something like this in motion a little bit more. But anything's better than I think. I mean, what we have right now, the 14 playoff is better than what we used to have is just the 2 teams. But as we learn anything from life, things evolve and things get better over time. So we'll see how that looks. I know a lot of people will be excited just for the 12-team playoff.
And I think you're on board with this to further your point about the expansion of the playoffs. And the pushback that I typically hear is, well, if there's 8 teams, then number 9 is going to complain. If you've got 12 teams, number 13 and 14 are going to complain. If you have 16 teams, number 17, number 18 are going to complain. Sure. There will whatever the cutoff is, there will always be teams that can say, our resume is just as good as number 12 or number 11, probably this case, number 11, because they'll be a Power 5. So that's understandable. Yes. But here are the 2 differences. One would be, okay, the more teams that are allowed in, there's a huge difference between, as you go through the 8-year history of this playoff, being number 5 and really having, an exclusive 4 and saying, hey, we got left out and we had just as good a resume, whether that's Penn State in 2016 or Ohio State in 2018 or fill in the blank, saying, there's only 4, and we are just as good as, we've got a comparable resume to number 4. If you can't make a 12-team field, then your argument is much less credible if you can't make a 12-team field. If you're 10-3, let's say, because you lost a conference championship game or whatever your situation, you're 10-2 and you can't make a 12-team field, then yes, is the decision-making process going to be perfect? No, it's not going to be. And yes, I'll even be sitting here saying, well, in a particular year, what about Wisconsin and what about Florida State? They both went 10-3, and I think they're just as good. So I'll be making arguments too. However, again, if you can't make a 12-team field, then you have much less of an argument. And number 2, and I think this is more of a valid point, is right now there is nothing that a team can do that can guarantee going to the playoff. That seems like a ridiculous statement, because I like to trip people up on this in the chat to say, what can a team do to guarantee that they're going to make the playoff? And the obvious question is, or the obvious response is, well, go undefeated, win your conference, go undefeated. Well, if all 5 conference champions go undefeated, somebody's going to get left out. So there's nothing you can do to guarantee that you can make the playoff. And that's a ridiculous system to have, that you can't, it's completely out of your control to make the playoff. So the good thing about the expanded playoff, whether that's 8, 12, and we know it's going to be 12, 8, 12, or 16, is that all the conferences are represented as well. And there's not this shunning of any one conference. The other answer to anybody who gets left out is, you know what? You had the opportunity to win your conference, and your conference gets at least 1 spot. So you always have that opportunity to win your conference and guarantee a spot.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, and it also, in terms of the guarantee, you're right on that as well. I mean, I think a lot of people would obviously assume it kind of depends on what team you are. If you go undefeated, whether or not you're
Sure.
going to, and it kind of goes back to my my previous point around not worrying necessarily um, about the school, and more about the resume, and how that works out. But no, you're exactly right. And I think in this scenario, if you have a um, you with 4 teams, if you're an undefeated SEC champion, you're while you still don't have no guarantee, I think your odds are greater than
Sure.
of any of the other teams,
Yeah.
obviously. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that's
Yes.
still a very
I was speaking technically, but yes, if you're the SEC champ, you're getting in. Yeah.
yeah. But I mean, if you're not an SEC, like if you're not and again, I think it still depends on who um who the team is. Let's say, get into a bizarre world. Let's say Vanderbilt, just for argument purposes. Vanderbilt is 12-0. Now that probably changes things. Like if you're Vanderbilt and 12-0 and you are 13-0 and you won the SEC championship, is it the same? Do we have the same conversation? Um, Maybe, I don't know. I mean, so that's why I struggle with kind of the way that the rankings are put together now, because you can tell it's very much they look at the resumes and then they compare the schools, um,
Yeah.
in a lot of ways, from my opinion, because if you look at a team that's not traditionally there, then maybe that decision making is a little bit different, or a little bit more difficult. My point being, in as we kind of wrap this up into the Big 12, TCU is a different situation than Oklahoma. TCU is a different situation than Texas. If Texas was sitting here undefeated, if Oklahoma was sitting here undefeated, they would probably, with the resume that they have, they would probably be ahead of Alabama, maybe top 4, top 5. And as it sits, they're they're where they're at.
And if it was Oklahoma this year instead of TCU, TCU's got this lousy non-conference slate against Colorado. So you could kind of blame their non-conference scheduling. But Oklahoma's win against Nebraska wouldn't be that impressive. They could be in the same shoe, same conference schedule, beat Nebraska, big deal, non-conference. But yes, it's Oklahoma. So yeah, just to wrap it up, and this will be my last statement, would be the couple things that I would love to see before we get to a 12-team playoff would be, number one, I would love to see a year in which the SEC champion loses 2 games and there are undefeated champions elsewhere, and to see if an SEC team with 2 losses as the champion would make it in over 0-loss undefeated conference champions. So to see if the SEC would get left out, number one. Number two, we almost got it this year with TCU. They were pretty bad last year, 5-7. So I don't think we've seen a team like a 5-7 team elevate this quickly in 1 year and contend this heavily for the playoffs. So I would love to see it to an extreme. Like I would like to see a 2-10 team, a 1-11 team, and then all the talk about, well, they were horrible last year, and just the let's focus on what's going on this year. It doesn't matter what happened last year. Last thing I'll say, Jason, would be, because Alabama played Texas and it was a 1-point game and most of us thought Texas outplayed them, it would be great if TCU annihilated Texas. Just as a comparison point, that would be great. If they won 48-7.
No, I think that would be. I mean, me and you are on the same page on this. Anything that we can do to create some chaos, just generally speaking, would be exciting for us, especially for this year with with Oklahoma not anywhere near in the in part of that conversation.
Sooners Live, folks, every Wednesday, 11:30 a.m. Central Time. Bring some friends with you next week, 11:30 a.m. Central every Wednesday. Hope you enjoyed it. Jason, thanks so much for making this work each and every week.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark.